John Hacker sat in the sterile courtroom, his back rigid, his hands clenched into fists so tight that his knuckles were white. The air felt suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in on him. He hadn't felt his heart beat so loudly in years, but today, it thudded in his ears, a reminder of the war he couldn't escape, even when the guns had fallen silent. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, but all he could see was the shadow of Max, his German shepherd, his partner, his best friend. A bond forged in the blood-soaked sand of foreign soil, under skies that rained fire and tears. Max had saved him more times than he could count, pulling him out of danger, guiding him through the worst of his nightmares. The dog's sharp instincts had kept him alive, had kept him human, when everything inside John screamed to let go. But the war had taken its toll on him. The explosions, the blood, the constant tension, they had shredded something inside, something that no amount of medicine or therapy had fixed. The court had labeled him a liability, unfit to care for anyone, let alone a dog trained for combat. And so they had taken Max away. But John had one request. One small, simple request. Just let me say goodbye. The courtroom murmured as the doors opened, and a uniformed officer led Max in. The dog's eyes searched the room, until they found John. The moment Max locked eyes with him, a surge of recognition flooded the room. The dog's tail wagged, a low growl of excitement rumbling in his chest, and with the kind of instinct only a battle-hardened soldier could understand, Max broke away from the officer's leash and bolted toward John. Time stopped. The room fell into silence. Max jumped into his arms, knocking him back into his chair, but John didn't care. His hands trembled as he held Max close, burying his face into the soft fur that smelled like home, like safety, like life before everything fell apart. Max licked his face, nuzzling him with such tenderness that John thought his heart might shatter. "You stayed," John whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You stayed even when I couldn't." The tears came then, not the silent kind he was used to, but a flood of grief that poured out of him. A lifetime of fear, regret, and loss that had built up over the years, finally breaking free in the one moment he had left with the only family that truly understood him. The judge watched in silence, her gavel forgotten. The prosecutor, who had once fought so hard to separate them, looked away, eyes glistening with an emotion he hadn't known was there. And for the first time in years, John didn't feel like a broken soldier. He felt like a man with something worth fighting for. The war ended years ago, but John Hacker never truly left the battlefield. It wasn't the gunfire, the explosions, or the bloodshed that haunted him. It was the silence, the stillness of the world when everything around you had been a constant roar of chaos. He had learned to survive on instinct, to keep moving, to never let his guard down. But when the world no longer required him to be in constant alert, that's when the true battle began. John had returned home with a shattered knee, the kind of injury that never really heals, not fully. The pain was always there, a constant reminder of his time in the service. His leg had been rebuilt with metal and screws, but there was no operation for what was broken inside of him. He was a soldier, a warrior who came back from war and found that the hardest battle was the one he fought with himself every single day. The streets of the city felt alien to him. The noise, the crowd, it all swirled together in a constant storm that made his pulse race and his breath shallow. He had to fight every moment to keep himself together. Crowded spaces, loud sounds, and fast-moving people triggered something deep within him, something primal, something that he couldn't control. And yet, through it all, there was Max. Max had been more than a war dog. Max had been his anchor. They had trained together, bled together, fought together. In the heat of combat, Max's unwavering loyalty had kept John alive. It was Max who had pulled him from the wreckage of a blown-up vehicle, Max who had tracked down insurgents in the night, Max who had stood guard when John couldn't sleep, when the nightmares came too fast and too loud. But Max wasn't just a soldier in the field. Max was his lifeline after it all ended. The transition to civilian life had been impossible for John. Everyone said it would be. They said the hardest part of returning home was not the battle, but the reintegration. The normal life was a place John had never truly understood, but with Max beside him, he had hope. The dog had a calming presence, his steady breathing and warm body acting as a shield against the world that overwhelmed him. They had been discharged together, both broken in their own way but still holding on. John wasn't sure how he would have made it without Max. The dog had become his constant companion, and John had thought, foolishly he now realized, that they could face the future together. He thought Max would always be there. But then everything fell apart. It was a cold November night when the shift in John's life began, a night that would change everything. The subway was crowded, the usual mass of hurried commuters, all pushing and shoving to get to their destinations. John hated the subway. The noise. The faces. The way everyone seemed so close, yet so far apart. He was trying to ignore the rising anxiety that gripped his chest when he heard the footsteps behind him. A man was walking too close, too fast. John's breath quickened. Not again, he thought, the instinctive panic rising in his chest. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. His mind flashed to a distant place, a memory of dust, smoke, and shouting. The man reached out a hand. John didn't know why he did it. His military training, his instincts kicked in. He turned, grabbed the man's wrist and spun him, slamming him against the wall of the subway platform. He could hear the crack of bone against stone. The man gasped, pain evident in his face. "Easy. I'm just trying to help," the man stammered. But John wasn't hearing him. He wasn't hearing anything. His mind was somewhere else, back in the heat of battle, in the land where enemies never gave you a moment's peace. The man was bleeding now, holding his side. His voice was a ragged whisper, but John didn't hear it. He saw the flashes of gunfire in his mind, the dust swirling, the screams, the pain. The police were called. The man was rushed to the hospital. John was arrested for assault. His heart hammered in his chest as he sat in the back of the squad car. He didn't understand what had happened. He couldn't remember the moments in between. The disorientation, the confusion, the aftermath. His mind felt like it was on fire, and yet he felt nothing. Max was at home waiting for him. In the holding cell, John sat in the corner, staring at the ground, lost in the chaos of his thoughts. His hands trembled, his pulse still hammering in his ears. The sirens, the flashing lights, they were all too familiar. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, and everything he had fought to forget came rushing back. The sound of the door opening pulled him out of his stupor. A guard stepped inside with a clipboard. "Mr. Hacker, you're being charged with assault. We're putting you through psychiatric evaluation. You're not fit to be around the public." John didn't answer. The words had no weight. He knew it was coming. He had known for years that something inside him was broken, something he couldn't fix. But it wasn't the war that had shattered him. It was the quiet, the return, the lack of danger, of purpose, of something to keep him from unraveling. "What about Max?" John asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. The guard raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" John's throat tightened. "I want to see him. He's my partner. He needs to be with me. Please. I need him." The guard shrugged. "We'll have to take him to the facility, Mr. Hacker. He's not allowed to stay with you. It's a risk." "No," John's voice cracked. "He's not a risk." The guard walked out without responding. John's body shook, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Max. The dog had been more than a companion. He had been the only thing keeping John from falling apart, the only thing that had made the world feel bearable. He didn't care about the trial. He didn't care about the charges. He cared about Max. As the hours passed, the stark realization hit him with the force of a punch. Max wasn't coming back. He would be taken to some government facility, reassigned, trained with new handlers, and forgotten. And John? He'd be left alone. No more bond, no more silent understanding. No more hope. John didn't cry for his own freedom. He didn't cry for the life that had crumbled to dust. He cried for Max. For the dog who had been more of a brother to him than anyone ever could be. In his cell, under the harsh light, John wept. And as the tears fell, he knew that no matter what happened next, there was nothing that could fill the void Max left behind. Nothing. The weeks that passed after the arrest felt like a blur to John. Time, which had always been a tool he used to measure progress and survival, had become meaningless. Days bled into one another, each one indistinguishable from the last. His life was reduced to the cold, hard walls of a holding cell and the clanging echoes of prison doors that seemed to mock him at every turn. The trial loomed ahead. He had been told by his attorney that pleading guilty would make things easier, but John didn't care about the sentence. He wasn't trying to avoid punishment. He didn't think he deserved anything less than the full weight of the law. No, what truly aided him was the thought of never seeing Max again. The dog who had been his lifeline, his shield, his salvation. To know that Max would be gone, out of his reach, out of his life forever, was more devastating than any prison sentence. On the day of the trial, John sat in the cold courtroom, hands shackled to the chair. The familiar smell of ink, paper, and antiseptic was inescapable. His attorney, a weary middle-aged man with a permanent frown, stood by him reviewing paperwork. But John wasn't looking at him. His eyes were fixed on the judge, who sat at the front, cold and stoic, behind her raised podium. The jury waited silently, the air heavy with anticipation. The prosecutor, a young man in a crisp suit, was making his case. He was thorough, methodical, and relentless. He spoke of John's crime, of the injury inflicted on the man at the subway station, of the trauma that led to his actions. John couldn't hear it. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the simple, aching thought, "I'll never see Max again." When the prosecutor finally finished his presentation, the judge turned to John. "Mr. Hacker," she began, her voice firm and cold, "you've pled guilty to assault. You've shown little remorse, and your actions, while understandable under the circumstances, still resulted in harm. The law is clear and we must uphold it." John nodded, resigned. He had made peace with the fact that his punishment was inevitable. But there was one thing he had to ask for, one final request. "I don't want any leniency," John said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "But I want to ask for something. Just let me say goodbye to Max." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly caught off guard by the request. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotion in the room. John's attorney, who had been preparing for the worst, blinked in surprise, unsure how to proceed. "Mr. Hacker," the judge said after a long pause, her gaze softening just a fraction, "I'm afraid that request is outside the bounds of the law. You're not to have contact with the animal." John's heart sank. This was it. This was the last chance he had to see Max, and it was slipping away before his eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. But before he could give up entirely, a voice echoed from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, if I may?" It was his attorney, standing up, looking more serious than John had ever seen him. "I'm aware of the severity of the situation, but we're talking about a bond here. A bond between a soldier and his canine partner. They've been through hell together. Surely you can see this isn't just a dog. It's something more than that." The judge's eyes flicked to the attorney, then back to John. There was a long, uncomfortable silence as she processed the request. John held his breath. The seconds stretched on like hours. Finally she spoke. "Very well. You may have 5 minutes. Under strict supervision. No more. And I am making no promises regarding the outcome of the case, Mr. Hacker." John didn't care about the outcome. All that mattered now was that he would see Max again. "Understood." The doors to the courtroom opened, and the unmistakable sound of paws clicking against the hard floors echoed through the room. John didn't need to see the dog to know who it was. The air in the room changed as Max entered, his eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto John. The dog's tail was still, his stance poised, but there was a spark in his eyes, something familiar. He had been trained for every possible scenario, but nothing could have prepared him for this moment. John stood, his hands shaking as he was unstuffed. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't care about the rules or the procedures. The instant Max saw him, the dog's body tensed, his tail wagging furiously. Then, without hesitation, Max bounded toward him, knocking John backward into his seat, sending a flood of emotions crashing over both of them. Max's face was pressed into John's chest, his body vibrating with excitement. The soldier wrapped his arms around the dog, holding him as if he never intended to let go. Max whimpered, the sound of the dog's distress tugging at John's heart. "I'm sorry, boy," John whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Max nuzzled him, his muzzle sliding into John's neck. He licked his face as if trying to comfort his partner, as if he understood the sorrow and the words that John couldn't speak. The courtroom had gone still. No one moved. No one breathed. John could feel the tears welling up in his eyes, but he didn't care. They had been through too much together, fought too many battles, both on the field and in their own minds, to let anything tear them apart now. In that moment, all that mattered was Max, the dog who had never left his side, the dog who had loved him when no one else could. The prosecutor, who had once been so confident in his position, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His gaze flicked to the judge, who sat motionless, her eyes heavy with the weight of what she was witnessing. The room felt smaller now, as though the air itself had thickened under the strain of the connection between man and animal. John didn't need to look at the prosecutor, didn't need to see the discomfort in his face. There was no turning back now. No more arguments. No more cases. For 5 minutes, the world outside of this room didn't exist. The only thing that mattered was this moment. A moment of reunion, of love, of finality. Max whimpered again, this time quieter, as though he too understood the gravity of the situation. John didn't pull away. He held Max tighter, buried his face in the dog's fur. He wanted to remember this feeling forever, the warmth, the comfort, the bond that no court could sever. They had fought together. They had survived together. And in this moment, they were together, even if only for a fleeting second. The gavel rang out, and the moment was gone. The prosecutor glanced at the judge, his discomfort palpable, but there was nothing he could say. No case to argue. In the presence of such raw emotion, what could the law do? As John released Max, the dog looked up at him one final time, the bond unspoken but understood. Max was led away by the officer, his eyes still fixed on John as the door closed behind him. In that instant John knew. This was the last time he would ever see Max again. And yet, for a brief moment in that cold, sterile courtroom, he had felt whole again. Judge Evelyn Mora had presided over hundreds of cases. She had sentenced killers, freed innocents, watched families fall apart and sometimes, miraculously, come back together. She had seen it all. The courtroom drama, the dry legal arguments, the passion of lawyers, the cold indifference of defendants. But nothing had prepared her for the raw, unfiltered emotion she had witnessed between John Hacker and Max. The tears in John's eyes as he held his dog, the way the dog clung to him, the bond that radiated from that single moment of reunion, it wasn't something she could easily forget. It wasn't just a man who had lost control and a dog who had been trained for war. It was a lifeline. It was the kind of thing you couldn't explain but only feel. A moment that transcended law, even if only for 5 minutes. She sat behind the bench, watching the two of them in silence, trying to reconcile the man before her with the criminal he had been painted to be. He wasn't just a soldier. He was someone who had been torn apart by the very thing he was trained to fight. And Max wasn't just a dog. He had been his partner, his savior, and in that moment, his salvation. Judge Mora glanced over at the prosecutor, who had his hands folded tightly in front of him. He was visibly uncomfortable, but even he couldn't deny the unspoken truth that hung in the air. This case wasn't just about the law. It was about something deeper. Something far more human. When the courtroom finally fell quiet again, Judge Mora cleared her throat. She adjusted the papers in front of her and fixed her gaze on John Hacker, who was still sitting with his head bowed, Max by his side. She had made up her mind. "Mr. Hacker," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I've presided over many cases. Some of them, I regret to say, have been far darker than this. But what I saw today, it wasn't just a man pleading for mercy. It was a man who is clearly broken. And a dog who has been a constant in your life, keeping you tethered to this world. John lifted his eyes, a flicker of hope crossing his face, though he tried to hide it. This dog is your family, Judge Mora continued, her voice softer now. He's not a weapon. He's not a tool. He's your anchor. And it's clear to me that you have both been through hell together, but you've also survived. You both need each other. And you can't heal unless you do it together. John sat up straighter, his heart pounding. His pulse thudded in his ears as he processed her words. Could it be? Was there hope? I am not going to send you to prison, Mr. Hacker, she said, her eyes locking with his. You've already been imprisoned by your own mind for far too long. Instead, I'm sentencing you to a PTSD recovery program. A specialized one. You will be required to attend weekly therapy sessions, and there will be strict supervision. But, she added, her gaze hardening slightly, you will also be allowed to keep Max as your therapeutic companion. I believe that the two of you can recover together, but only if you both make a commitment to it. John's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't believe it. This wasn't what he had expected. It wasn't even what he had dared to hope for. He had been certain that this courtroom, this moment, was the final chapter in a story of loss. But now there was a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. There are conditions, Mr. Hacker, Judge Mora said, pausing for emphasis. You will attend every therapy session, no exceptions. You will be required to participate fully. If at any point you fail to comply, if you slip, if you refuse to seek help, you will be sent to prison. John nodded slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. There were no second chances. This was it. This was the path forward, but it wasn't going to be easy. She turned her gaze to Max, who was sitting patiently by John's side, his head resting against his handler's knee. The dog looked up at her with intelligent, soulful eyes. And Max, Judge Mora continued, Max will be registered as your service animal. You are both part of this recovery program now. I'm giving you the chance to prove that you can heal, that you can rebuild your life. But remember this, Mr. Hacker, this is not a request. It's a mission. You're going to have to work for it. John's chest tightened, a mix of emotions surging through him, gratitude, disbelief, and a deep sense of responsibility. He had been given a chance. He could barely wrap his mind around it. This wasn't just a reprieve from the system. It was a chance at redemption. A chance to finally find peace. I won't let you down, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He looked down at Max, who, sensing the change in atmosphere, looked up at him with his unspoken understanding. I won't let either of us down. Judge Mora nodded once, a small, approving gesture. I hope that's true, Mr. Hacker. I really do. The courtroom was silent for a moment before something unexpected happened. The prosecutor, who had argued so fervently for John's punishment, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His expression softened, and for a brief second, he glanced at the jury. Then, to the surprise of everyone, he slowly, hesitantly began to clap. It started as a single, tentative clap. Then a few more joined in. Soon, the entire courtroom was applauding, not for the decision itself, but for what it represented. A man and his dog given a chance at healing, at starting over. A bond that had survived war, trauma, and loss was being given the opportunity to grow, to rebuild. John's eyes welled with tears. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It was an overwhelming wave of emotion, a relief so deep that it felt almost physical. He looked down at Max, who was looking up at him with quiet understanding, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Thank you, John whispered, his voice barely audible, but Max seemed to understand. He nudged John's hand, offering silent comfort, his presence the only anchor John needed in that moment. And for the first time in a long, long time, John allowed himself to feel something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. The clinic was tucked away on the edge of a forest, quiet and untouched by the city's relentless noise. A place where the world slowed down, where time seemed to take a breath. It wasn't a hospital. It didn't have the sterile walls, the cold linoleum floors, or the mechanical hum of machines. No, this place felt more like a safe house for broken souls, a retreat for those who had seen too much and couldn't forget. John pulled up to the gravel driveway with Max by his side, the dog sitting obediently in the passenger seat. He looked out the window, staring at the tall trees that surrounded the clinic, their branches swaying in the wind, as if they were welcoming him into something new. But inside he was still fighting the same battles he had fought for years. The scars on his body were easy to see, but the ones on his soul were far harder to heal. He stepped out of the truck, the gravel crunching underfoot, his knee aching with every step. Max, ever the faithful companion, padded alongside him, his large body acting as a steady presence. John didn't know what to expect from the clinic. He didn't know if this was going to work or if it was just another failed attempt to fix what was broken. But he had no choice. The judge had made it clear, he had to try. And for the first time in a long time, John was willing to do whatever it took. The first few days were a blur. The clinic was unlike anything John had ever experienced, a far cry from the rigid, militant structure he was used to. There were no schedules to follow, no commanding officers barking orders. Instead, there were soft-spoken counselors, gentle encouragements, and a group of other veterans who had each carried their own burdens. But even in this place, John remained distant. He kept to himself, his words few, his thoughts tangled in the horrors of war that he couldn't escape. Group therapy was the hardest part. John sat at the edge of the circle, his eyes downcast, his fists clenched in his lap. He had been in therapy before, back when the VA forced him into it, but that had been nothing more than a box to check. There had been no connection, no understanding. Just words floating in the air, meaningless. The group spoke in turn, stories of ambushes, of lives lost, of promises made and broken. Each one revealed their wounds, their pain, their haunted pasts. But John stayed silent. What could he say? What would they think of him? He had already lived a life of shame, a life of darkness. What could a room full of strangers offer that would help? But then during one session Max nudged his arm. It was a small gesture, nothing grand, nothing theatrical. Just a soft push of his wet nose against John's hand. Max had always been in tune with John's moods, sensing the smallest shifts in his emotions. But this time it felt different. It was as if the dog was telling him, "It's okay. You don't have to do this alone." John looked down at Max and then, for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to speak. "I was in Kandahar," he began, his voice low, like he was speaking through a fog. "It was supposed to be a routine mission. Get in, get out. But it went south fast." His hands shook as he spoke, and the words came in fits and starts, like shards of broken glass. He couldn't remember the exact details of the ambush, not clearly, but the faces of his fallen comrades were burned into his memory. He could still hear the screams, the cries for help. And the worst part? He could still hear the voice of his best friend, the one he couldn't save. "I tried to pull him out," John's voice cracked. "But I couldn't, he was already gone. I let him die." The words tumbled out in a flood, and once they started they didn't stop. The guilt, the shame, the nightmares that never let him sleep. How his mind was always trapped in Kandahar, always reliving that moment when everything went wrong. Every failed mission, every mistake, every soldier who never made it home. "I killed him," John whispered, the weight of it almost unbearable. There was silence in the room. For a long time no one spoke. John thought he might have said too much, that he might have crossed a line, but then he felt something. A subtle shift in the air. One by one the others began to share their own stories. The faces around him weren't strangers anymore. They were people who understood. People who had walked the same path, felt the same pain. They didn't pity him. They didn't judge him. They just listened. And for the first time in years, John didn't feel like a monster. He felt like a mirror. A reflection of the soldiers who had been through the same hell, who had carried the same burdens. He wasn't alone. Max stayed by his side the whole time, lying at his feet, his head resting on John's lap as if he understood the magnitude of the moment. Max had always been his anchor, but now, in this moment, Max was more than just a dog. He was a reminder that John could still heal, that he could still move forward. As the weeks went by, John began to open up more in therapy. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of his past felt too heavy to carry. But with Max at his side, John learned to take it one step at a time. Slowly, he began to trust the process, to believe in the possibility of healing. Max became a fixture at the clinic. He wasn't just John's service animal anymore. He was the clinic's unofficial mascot. He would sit with new patients, resting his head in their laps, offering silent comfort when words weren't enough. Max seemed to understand without needing to be told anything. He knew who needed him most, and he always knew just how to help. John started volunteering with Max, helping out around the clinic. He spent time with the new patients, sharing his story, his experience. He wasn't there to be a hero, but to offer what he could: a listening ear, a kind word, a reminder that healing was possible. Max was always there by his side, a living symbol of survival, of hope. It wasn't just the therapy sessions that helped him heal. It was the small moments, the quiet mornings spent walking through the forest with Max, the nights spent lying in bed with the dog curled up beside him, the slow but steady rebuilding of his trust in himself and the world around him. And then one day, as he sat outside with Max, watching the sun set behind the trees, John realized something. He was whole again. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole. He had learned to live with his past, to accept that some things would never be forgotten. But he had also learned that healing was a journey, not a destination. It was about taking the next step, no matter how small, and finding peace with what was. Max, his faithful companion, sat beside him, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Together they had made it through the darkest of days. And together they would face whatever came next. 6 months had passed since the courtroom had seen John Hacker and Max, and in that time, everything had changed. The darkness that once clung to John's every step had begun to lift, piece by piece. There were still bad days, of course. Days when the past tried to rise up like a wave threatening to pull him under. But those moments were fewer now. With Max by his side, and with the dedication he had poured into his recovery, John had begun to rebuild the life he thought he had lost forever. The courtroom doors opened once again, but this time, John stepped through them with a confidence he hadn't known in years. He wore a dark suit, crisp and tailored, his posture straight, a calm smile on his face. He no longer looked like a man trapped by his past. He looked like a man who had made peace with it. And beside him, as always, was Max, his loyal companion, his partner in both war and peace. The dog walked proudly by his side, his coat gleaming, tail wagging with the same unshakable confidence that John now carried in his heart. The judge, Evelyn Mora, was already seated, her eyes studying them both with an expression that was warm yet thoughtful. John took a seat in front of her, and Max settled at his feet, lying down with a quiet dignity that seemed to match the solemnity of the room. The proceedings were different this time. There were no accusations, no debates over what had happened in the past. Instead, there was a soft silence as Judge Mora looked at John, her gaze reflecting both curiosity and approval. She spoke first, her voice a little gentler than before. "Mr. Hacker, you asked for this meeting, and I wanted to hear how you've been progressing. So tell me, how are you?" John took a deep breath, steadying himself before speaking. His voice was firm, yet filled with a softness that came from months of healing, of confronting the things he had long buried. "I've kept my end of the deal," John said, his voice steady. "Therapy every week. Group sessions. And Max. He's not just my dog. He's the reason I'm alive. He saved me, Your Honor. Not just once, but every day." Max's tail thumped softly on the floor in response, as if in agreement. The dog had been with John every step of the way, through the highs and the lows, always there to pull him back from the edge when it felt like too much to bear. And John had come to realize something in the months since his sentencing. Max wasn't just a service animal. He was a lifeline. The judge's lips curled into a soft smile, and she nodded in acknowledgement. "I can see that. It's evident, Mr. Hacker, that you've made incredible progress. And what about you? How are you doing truly?" John's gaze shifted slightly, his eyes flickering with something deeper. Something that spoke of struggle but also of growth. "I'm learning to forgive myself," John said, his voice quiet but resolute. "One day at a time. There are days when the weight of what happened feels like too much, but I know now that healing isn't linear. It's not a straight path. But I'm here. And I'm better because of Max." The judge's smile widened, and for a moment, her gaze softened with something almost maternal. "It's a powerful thing, self-forgiveness. I'm proud of you, Mr. Hacker. And proud of Max too. I believe you're going to make it." The words of affirmation hung in the air like a bomb, soothing a part of John he hadn't realized was still raw. He had spent so long running from his past, so long feeling like he didn't deserve peace, but now he could feel the truth settling within him. He was on the right path. Not perfect but moving forward. The session ended, and as John and Max stood to leave, something unexpected happened. The same prosecutor who had once fought to strip Max away from him, who had seen John only as a criminal, a danger, stepped forward. The man hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice quieter than usual. "I was wrong," the prosecutor admitted, his words carrying the weight of regret. "About everything. About you. About Max. I see now. I see now what you two have, and I understand why you needed each other." John looked at the man, and for the briefest of moments their eyes met. John didn't need to say anything. The prosecutor's words were enough. The truth had come full circle, and even the man who had once sought to separate him from Max now understood the bond that could not be broken. John nodded once, acknowledging the shift in the prosecutor's perspective. "We all fight battles," he said quietly. "Some just aren't visible." The prosecutor looked down, clearly grappling with his own thoughts, but there was no more judgment in his eyes. Only understanding. John turned away, feeling the weight of that brief exchange, and knowing that it was yet another step forward. Another part of his past and Max's that had been healed. Understood. As they left the courthouse, the sun was shining brighter than it had in years. There was a quiet peace in the air, the kind that only came after a storm had passed. And as John walked with Max by his side, they weren't just walking out of a courtroom. They were walking into a new chapter, one where the past no longer held them captive. But as they made their way to the doors, they were met by something unexpected. A crowd. It wasn't a crowd of protesters or angry voices demanding justice. It wasn't a crowd filled with judgment or disdain. No, this was different. This was a crowd that had gathered to show their support, to show their respect. Veterans stood at the front, their faces solemn but proud. Families, some with children holding up signs that read, "Thank you, John," and "Thank you, Max," stood behind them. The applause was gentle at first, a slow ripple of sound, but as John and Max made their way down the steps of the courthouse, it grew louder, warmer. People cheered. People clapped. People were standing, applauding the man who had once been broken, and the dog who had never given up on him. It was then that John realized, the story of him and Max had spread far beyond the courtroom. It had touched lives. It had given others hope. Hope that even the darkest of pasts could be overcome. Hope that forgiveness was possible. And hope that sometimes a final goodbye wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. John glanced down at Max, who looked up at him with those soulful eyes, his tail wagging in time with the applause. And for the first time in a long time, John felt the weight of the world lift. It was no longer about the battle. It was about the journey. And he and Max together were walking into the future.